And up next, we will be discussing about the acceleration of Regtech. What's next in 2021? To discuss this in detail, we have Diana Paredes, Chief Executive Officer and Co-founder, Suade Labs; Chionh, Co-founder and Chief Executive Officer, Cynopsis Solutions; Darius Liu, Co-founder and Chief Operating Officer, iSTOX. And our moderator for this session, she is Mélisande Mual, Managing Director, The Paypers. Let's welcome all of them.
Okay, great. And good afternoon or good morning, and welcome everyone to our panel, The Acceleration of Regtech and What's Next for 2021. So my name is Mélisande Mual. I'm the publisher of The Paypers, the leading global source of news and analysis for professionals in payments and FinTech. And I'm delighted to moderate this session with a wonderful panel of founders in Regtech and a founder of a FinTech company that is relying on this technology. So I would like to start asking the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and a remark to the audience. We have questions. If we have questions, there is time, let's say 10 minutes for a Q&A at the end of the session. So do reach out to our panelists. So first of all, I would like to ask Diana to briefly introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. We at Suade have been basically normalizing and helping to clean large amounts of data for the purposes of having regulatory outputs in the form of analytics and reporting and calculations. We're World Economic Forum technology pioneers and have been doing a lot of things with Singapore in the past few years, so very excited to be here.
Great. Chye.
Hi, this is Chye. I'm the CEO, co-founder of a Regtech company that focuses on AML, KYC, and CTF processes, where we help our clients automate the manual and digitize the analog. So Cynopsis Solutions has also been awarded MAS FinTech Award back in 2018. And on the part-time basis, I also teach compliance with International Compliance Association, as well as I double head as the chair of the Regtech subcommittee within Singapore FinTech Association.
Great. And Darius?
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. My name is Darius Liu. I'm the COO and co-founder of iSTOX. iSTOX is the world's first regulated platform to offer issuance, settlement, custody, and secondary trading for digitized securities. And through the platform, we offer accredited investors from all over the world access to interesting and exciting investment opportunities that would otherwise be out of reach, right? Basically helping investors build better portfolios, make more money. And issuers, on the other hand, can gain access to other segments of capital markets in a compliant, cost-effective manner. So if it's not apparent to you, everyone here, I'm not a Regtech company, but I'm one of the beneficiaries of the Regtech revolution. So I'm very happy to be here.
Great, brilliant. So in today's session, we will talk about basically the size of the market, the different verticals, what is driving innovation, and what future developments the speakers predict for 2021 and beyond that will make compliance more effective and efficient. So with regard of the size of the market, Juniper Research forecasts Regtech spending will exceed 127 billion by 2024, up from 25 billion in 2019. So huge growth. And before we start talking about what is driving this acceleration of growth in this market, let's start with some scene setting. So what is Regtech, and what are the different verticals or segments that we discern? Chye, could you please kick off and mention something about what you think Regtech is and the different segments that you see in this market?
Sure, thanks, Mélisande. Now, Regtech itself is actually the short form for regulatory technology in general, and regulatory technology is actually something that basically anyone who uses, or any company who uses technology to improve a regulatory outcome, you know, at the end of the day, whether you're financial regulated companies or in other sectors as well. So regulatory technology can be applied across various types of sectors, not just within financial services sector. Now, within the Regtech I would say, a universe, right? There are definitely lots of verticals. And one of the big verticals that we play in, for example, will be the verticals of identity management, AML, anti-money laundering, CTF, counter-terrorism financing, as well as know your customers, which typically people calls it KYC. So that vertical is very, very huge because as part of what you mentioned, Mélisande, about the spending in 2024, I think it's also equivalent, is equivalently important to look at how much banks and financial institutions has actually paid fines or have actually been sanctioned. The penalties that has been handed out to them over the years has been tremendous as well. So there is an immediate need for technology or the use of appropriate use of technology to come in to help financial institution sectors as well as non-financial sectors to actually get a better regulatory outcome. So other sectors, other verticals within the Regtech spheres, as far as I know, will include things like regulatory compliance, including things like monitoring and surveillance, fraud detection, as well as things like you help people to automate and digitize regulations and be able to interpret regulation. I think that's probably something that Suade does as well. So there is a lot of verticals in this, but I think it's good to think about it as what are the must-have versus what are the good to have. Because where people are looking around for solutions or options, they typically look at areas whereby they have the greatest need or greatest demand, because maybe there's a regulatory issue. The regulators say you need to have this sector, this area covered, and therefore at the moment AML CTF, in my view, is actually the I would say the hottest must-have base level without a doubt.
Yeah, thanks. So KYC and CTF, combating financial crime, terrorism. Diana, any thoughts on this? How do you discern the market?
Yeah, I mean, I think the different verticals just described make a lot of sense. When it comes to Regtech, from my perspective, it is really 101 enterprise software innovation. I think it's a bit broader than, I guess, what we're all used to. I think about it in terms of specific verticals. Obviously, I think that the area of like interpretation or regulation is also very hot, and the piece of like reporting and basically submitting on the back of the things that have come out since the financial crisis in a way that's correct and accurate has become very important for regulators as well. So I think that the regulators have also started to really look at what enterprise software is doing in the industry. There's a huge operational risk that's very real. There's a lot of problems about fundamentally this interpretation of the rule happening in a very manual way, which is basically where Regtech can help to basically accelerate that process of adoption and implementation of efficient rules to avoid another financial crisis. And so when I think of Regtech in general, so the verticals that my colleague was mentioning, they all make a lot of sense, and that's basically what we're doing in regulatory innovation. But I think that if you wanted to kind of label it under a wider umbrella, it is also about really innovating in enterprise software. And in financial services, enterprise software and I guess large type incumbent companies have often been getting away with murder with not really good technology and something that's barely better than Excel. And so what companies like ours can really propose is real automation, real digitalization, really an opportunity to basically adopt regulation in a way that's a lot more efficient than what we have seen in the past, and innovating through different architecture, different technology, new technologies than what we have been doing as an industry in the past.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Diana. And when we talk about, must have and good to have from the perspective of a startup, I understand, Darius, that iSTOX acquired a license earlier this year, being a startup investment platform. So what were sort of the must-have Regtech solutions that you benefit from? And what in your perspective are sort of the more good-to-have solutions for your particular company?
Well, it's very simple, really, right, Mélisande? The must-haves are anything that are required for us to maintain compliance with our licensing framework, right? So things like KYC, things like compliance with the AML regulations and such, those are non-negotiables, right? And the MAS doesn't look kindly on any breaches of that sort. So to the extent that we have Regtech solutions that allow us to streamline the process of onboarding and while maintaining compliance to those standards, that's obviously pretty much a no-brainer for us. So we have onboarded, in fact, Chye's solution, right? I'm very happy to mention that here because he's been such an excellent partner. It's literally, through the API connection, that flow of the client profile and then that customer risk rating that comes back in less than a minute, compared to some of the legacy workflows that we are all used to from banks and so on. I think that's really, something that really sped up our growth and our process and our onboarding of customers right from the get-go. In terms of good to haves, now those would be solutions that speak to speeding up and lowering costs, but don't necessarily speak to direct compliance with any regulations, right? So, for example, multi-language support. For example, automating the downloading of customer profiles from the MyInfo equivalents from other countries, right? Those things basically speed up the process, but they don't necessarily meet any sort of notice or regulation from the MAS. So those will be really good to have. I'll be very happy if those solutions come onto the market in a very cost-efficient way. And we're always looking out for more of these things to bring on board.
Yeah. And Darius, when you are looking into partners that could help you with KYC or the screening part, what criteria weighted most for you? Because there's quite a lot of solutions out there. How did you go through this selection process?
I think the integration is important one for us because with any partners that we work with, there will be API integrations and there will be integrations on our platforms and customizations that sort of, make the workflow seamless, right? So to the extent that we can work with one versus multiple partners, that would be a lowering of the resource intensity on our side, as well as the complexity of the workflows. So if we have one partner that can do a variety of Regtech solutions for us through maybe one API call, that would be obviously a better solution than having to work with, let's say, 3 or 4.
Yeah. Makes perfect sense. So we were talking about the huge growth in this market. What is driving this growth? I mean, come on, 125 billion in a couple of more years. Diana, what are your thoughts on this?
I think that there is a reality that the regulators are part of the reason as well, because I think that it's very clear that the fines and the consequences for doing things not in the right way are pretty tremendous. And you're seeing, for our space, for example, very large fines like with Citi, 400 million fine from the regulator for basically not doing the things they're supposed to be doing, which, for example, you can really do with our technology. So I think that the regulators themselves and the fines in the space definitely drive that. And actually, I think COVID, for us at least, has been a huge accelerator. So like I was mentioning, when it comes to enterprise software innovation, what you find in the past is that usually to implement this kind of technologies or the enterprise software piece in financial services, the implementation was actually very manual. So nothing like the API world that we were just discussing. And so what that means is that you have to have a lot of people on site. There is a huge dependency on people coming to the offices and doing things on systems quite manually. Whereas Regtechs are definitely going to be much more prone to just API seamless type integration, and things like COVID that basically have accelerated the pace of need for digitization are also going to accelerate the growth for next year. We have seen a lot more demand and a lot of growth coming just from the fact that people were saying, well, this solution basically can just not be implemented remotely versus something that can be like a much more open API type architecture, which is how modern Regtechs operate basically.
Cool. Thanks, Diana. Chye, any thoughts on this?
Yeah,
Who's driving this growth?
I think, well, for one, I'm not complaining. There is a big driver for the growth, for sure, right? I'm pretty sure Diana is not complaining as well. Now, more seriously, I think the reality is that, I mean, myself, I've been a compliance officer for a long time before we founded Cynopsis back in 2014, 2015 time. And, the concept of Regtech only kind of came about in 2017, thereabout. And the reality is that over the last 10, 20 years or so, the regulatory requirement across the world, be it AML, KYC, or market misconduct and various other things, I can only say that it has been going one way, which is upwards, right, in terms of the number of rules that and regulation that has been thrown at the industry around the world, as well as the complexity of the regulation, because a lot of transactions are done cross-border, and therefore there's a need to, I would say, not compete with each other, but regulators needs to catch up with each other. Yeah, so that makes the underlying premise. I would say landscape complicated to begin with. So which means that you can't get away with just doing it manually, or using Excel spreadsheet and pretend to go through transaction monitoring, for example. This is not going to work. So that's definitely one huge driver. But I would also want to say that, as Diana has mentioned, COVID or the push for digitization have somewhat accelerated very much in the last 9 months or so. It's just a phenomenon for everyone, exponential. But one thing for sure is that as we talk about companies or organizations that has the technical know-how to do API implementation and connectivity, don't forget that there is a long tail of traditional tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 traditional financial institutions that do not have that technical know-how to do API connectivity. So it doesn't necessarily mean that therefore they should be excluded from the Regtech or excluded to have access to Regtech solutions. So I think for Regtech providers, I mean, we sell our software as a service, so it could either take it as a subscription without API connectivity, plug and go. We give you a web login, it's web application, or for people like iSTOX and some other FIs that we work with, or FinTech we work with, then they do the API. So that will ensure that I term this concept as regulatory inclusion, because a lot of people talk about financial inclusion, but I think the existence of Regtech or technology to help people get to a better regulatory outcome cannot exclude people who does not have the technical know-how to do so. So that in a way have also accelerated the growth of the market, because people are getting into the likes of wanting to know a little bit more. Maybe they may not have a huge technical department to do the API, but they want to get on the bandwagon to improve or get their AML, for example, AML compliance processes in a better position in front of the regulator. That's number 2. And just finishing up here, number 3, the bad actors or the scammers and the bad guys are not resting on their laurels as well, which means that they're also using technologies. And during COVID, there's a lot more scams reported across the world, and which means that that would have also been a fuel for, let's say, the larger financial institutions to invest more heavily on Regtech solutions to ensure that they are able to combat and catch up with these criminals' activities.
Yeah, so basically the complexity of the regulation, the digitization, as you mentioned, well, technology, of course, and the increased sophistication of the bad guys as well, with things like, I recently saw some more information about deep fakes, and it was pretty horrifying, actually. So let's continue to the next topic, which addresses basically the benefits of Regtech and the implementation of this. So if you look at the benefits of Regtech, Diana, your company offers a regulation as a service. So what technologies does your company leverage, and how does it help regulated entities, or maybe even the regulators?
Yeah, so basically the regulation as a service piece for us has been the demonstration for the industry that you could really leverage off things like natural language processing and automation to fundamentally change regulation into code. And so what that has meant for our customers is that in the same way that we were talking about, it's not realistic to go through an Excel spreadsheet line by line by eye. It also is not realistic to expect, like a human being to decipher the regulation, by themselves on like the hundreds of thousands of regulatory lines and the code that has to be put together to basically take data to a particular format of submission. And so there is a reality in the work that we do where we are seeing that what helps our customers is that instead of focusing a lot of time and wasting a lot of time in the preparation of data, in the preparation of what they have to send, they actually have finally some time to analyze what they're doing. So you're really seeing that Regtech and this kind of technologies can really help move away resources from, the really manual work that they were doing before to more analysis and intelligent insights into what actually is being sent to the regulators. So when you think about how this helps the industry is that, our motto, for example, is about preventing the next financial crisis. A lot of the regulation that we deal with is basically on the backdrop of what happened in 2008. And what you find is that to implement those really efficiently, and not only as a one-off, but also given the fact that the regulators are changing the regulation all the time, what you need is technologies that can accelerate that through natural language processing, through machine learning, because there is a certain element of automation that's very real. Some of the things that we were presenting, for example, at Davos this year, were very much about use cases, about how we leverage of those kind of technologies to turn the regulation into code, like I mentioned. And the reason that's something that's very, pertinent is because instead of having 600 days of professional services to configure one thing, you're really looking at a world where you can actually create regulatory outputs and turn this regulation into something that's machine readable in a matter of minutes. And so that's how you accelerate and help the industry, because you're really moving away from the manual, tedious effort to something that gets you to 80-90% through technology, and where you really put a human in the loop for the last mile, where you really can leverage your human intelligence, and where you really want this kind of human expertise to get you to 100% accuracy, which is what the regulators are really after.
Yeah, and Diana, maybe a follow-up question on this. What are the challenges of selling this solution? It sounds like maybe a strange question, but if you say, basically stuff that you do with like a team of 100, you can do it with just a couple of people. Who is your buying person at the other side of the table, and what challenges do you encounter to get this message across?
Yeah, it's actually a really good question. It's not a bad question at all. I think the biggest challenge, what we have realized is, when we started, people would say, well, there is legacy technology, there's the spaghetti code, the data is a mess, all of that. And over time, what you realize is actually technology, like modern, good technology, good implementation, good, agile ways of working, can actually solve most of those kind of issues, right? So technology that's out there now can do things that people couldn't do 20 years ago. And so that's a no-brainer. The hardest piece is really legacy mentality, right? So people who are used for the past 20 years to do compliance in a certain way, to do regulatory submissions in a certain way, in a very manual way. And so the really the biggest hurdle, I think, for innovators, like it is, since the age of dawn, is always really trying to really take your customer along through that thinking, and to really make that leap of, listen, I know you're used to hiring 100 people to do this, and then now you can do this in a couple of hours. You just need to be comfortable doing that, right? And so that's the journey, I think, for an innovator in telling that story, in inspiring people, in believing that that's possible. And fortunately, I think that now there's also very tangible ways to demonstrate that, right? So whether you're doing it through like a quick POC or something that demonstrates the value in a way that you can just see it, definitely helps. And one of the ways that we have seen to be that most efficient is obviously to also target senior management and the people in the trenches, because then they kind of help you squeeze in into the middle management layer, which is actually quite efficient when you're basically trying to really change the industry and change the thinking within an organization, because it's usually very senior people that have to look at strategic things, and the people who have to do the work that are going to be your best friends, because they will see the advantages of your technology a lot faster than maybe the middle layer that doesn't necessarily work in either extreme.
So yeah, that's a multi-level approach, and I guess pretty long sales cycles. But no, thank you for your insights here, Diana. Chye, can you elaborate a little bit on the challenges for you bringing this solution to market? And maybe you can elaborate a little bit on sort of the smaller and the larger customers and the differences between these segments.
For sure. Now, maybe I go one step back, because I think your earlier questions around benefits, I think people like to assess any solutions that they looked at, cost benefit analysis, it's always cost at the end of the day, everything is very price sensitive and so on and so forth. But I think at the end of the day, like what Darius has mentioned earlier on, that if we talk about the must-have sets of, I would say, requirements that need to be complied with, then you want to make sure that whatever solution that you bring on, or whatever Regtech that you consider, or enterprise solutions you consider, you need to be able, when I say you, refers to the regulated entities and the compliance department within the regulator, as well as the senior management, because they're ultimately responsible to comply with the regulations. So then you need to be able to break down into two. You must be able to break down the solution into two parts. One is preventive control, the second part being detective control. Because the combinations of preventive and detective controls will ensure that you have a sound risk-based approach in your implementation of whatever solutions you want to implement. Sometimes you may want to tighten the threshold a little bit because you are a bit concerned about people coming from this sector or this country or this jurisdiction, and sometimes you want to loosen your control a little bit because maybe these people bring lower risk of violation to you, for example, right? So when you consider that, then you will be able to see the benefits of Regtech can be multifaceted, because just take AML KYC as an example. The whole process, of trying to be compliant is not at the customer onboarding point. That is really the beginning, because no one can actually launder any money without doing a transaction. They can't just open an account and say, hey, I've completed money laundering. You can't. They will have to open a number of accounts with a few players and potentially starts to do a series of transactions. And that's where your control points and your control checkpoints and your Regtech providers need to be able to explain to you where are all your control points sitting and which point in time they get activated on an ongoing basis, periodic basis, or when significant activity changes, for example. So that will be where you would determine the benefits, for example, or perhaps the challenges. Now, on the implementation point of view, for the larger organization, is always a lot more challenging for us historically. In the past, it's getting a little bit easier, because in the past, a lot of them wants on-prem server deployment type of a solution, which gets which makes it a little bit harder, but it's not impossible, but we can do it. It's just not very scalable from a business point of view. Whereas if it's on predominantly Regtech solutions are typically on the cloud, which is one of the benefits, because it's more cost efficient, it's more scalable, and in fact, it's actually much more secure than we host it in our office, although our office is actually very secure because it's within the MAS building, so that's that's a separate thing. I guess the point is that the challenge is always that, because the mentality, as what Diana mentioned, the legacy mentality is always one of the biggest hurdle. Now, if I run a compliance department that has got 100 people, would I want to bring in a solution and say cut my headcount by half? I mean, who would do that? I've been the head of compliance before myself, but it will be a very difficult decision to make. Right, that's number one. And also, or if you're on the technology side of things, you may have similar considerations as well, because you may have multiple projects that you're running. So one of the other, I would say that the easier implementation will be with a similar kind of outfit, like a FinTech solutions, like iSTOX and the likes. So we talk the same language. We are operating in the same kind of a landscape. So that sort of makes it a lot easier for us. And also, we'll be surprised that actually the traditional financial institutions, as well as even the non-financial services sector players, are actually very keen to get on Regtech solutions to improve their processes, because they see this as a burden. And if anything that can be a Panadol to take away their pain, then they would want it at the price point that doesn't break their bank.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Chye. Well, let's go to the topic of basically the title of this panel, the future. So how do you envision the future of Regtech? What will be the next evaluation? Chye, could you kick off?
Yeah, I think, well, obviously, I hope to have a lot more business, and I think one thing for sure, if you think about it, as I've sort of alluded to earlier on, Regtech is not just for the big boys to improve their processes or to get rid of their legacy inefficiency and so on. It's actually to ensure that in order to have a better regulatory outcome for, say, for example, for Singapore or for any country, the long tail of the players must be on board the digitization journey, which will also include Regtech. So my view of the future is that that will be made much more available, across different customer size, I would say. That's number one. And number two, I think there will be further emphasis for sure, because if you're helping someone to comply better with regulation, that means your solution, ultimately being a technology solution, should not increase the risk of technology risk or security risk or data privacy risk for your customers. So the emphasis on ensuring that Regtech solutions are built, what's the better term to use? To build with industrial strength security standards, and adopts industry best practice, like ISO 27001, SOC 2 and all these other standards, and data privacy standards complying with PDPA in Singapore, GDPR in Europe and the rest of the world. So these are the things that I think Regtech providers need to actually be on top of and be ahead of as well in order to continue the growth of the sector. Otherwise, it will fall apart. That's my quick sense.
Yeah, maybe if I may add to bring in the perspective of basically not so much the regulator or the regulated companies, but the customers of these regulated companies. I always use the example of basically an SME that wants to open up offices across borders. That is currently a nightmare. I mean, it's been debated a lot. It can take more than 12 months to just get access to account, even if you want to have an account in your own bank. We talked about it, Chye, in the prep as well. You've been through this, basically messy processes. We've gone through this. I was wondering, if you look into the future of FinTech, will this issue be, what is the issue about, and will this eventually be solved by in the future? Because if you look into the actual businesses or consumers, it can be pretty annoying, these compliance processes.
I go first, yeah. I think well, look, that's the holy grail. If I have the solution to that, then yeah, I'll rule the world. But the reality is this is not a technology solution. I would suggest. It's very much more like you just pointed out something that requires I would say cross jurisdictional harmonization, so to speak, as well as government, the G to G type of a collaboration. The ability for an legal entity incorporated in Singapore to be able to rock up to Amsterdam, to be able to say, hey, I want to open an account there because I've opened an account in Singapore. How is there going to be a mutual recognition of standards, although everyone follows the FATF standards, but that's just very broad based. But I think G to G is probably one way to talk about that, as well as the supervisory technology side of things, that they could have better collaboration with each other. That's number two. And number three, if you go down to where you talk about account opening, the fundamental thing is our own identity in our jurisdiction is issued by, say, for example, in Singapore it's ICA, in other places it's other agencies, but the digital identity piece is being handled at the moment by each country on its own, like Singapore, Darius talked about MyInfo and so on and so forth. Other countries, Estonia and all that, have their own little digital identity registry. But I do not think that these registries are actually talking to each other, and let alone these registries are not being tapped by participants outside of that jurisdiction to begin with. So if there is an ability to interact or interoperate across registry, then that will be a massive win. Number two, if there are corporate registries across the world can actually again interoperate and allow the public access, maybe without charging a fee, then that will make it a lot more seamless.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe a Darius perspective on this. If you look into sort of what is your biggest challenge now in your, basically in growing your company, in onboarding customers from multiple jurisdictions, can you elaborate a little bit on this and how you feel the future of Regtech might, basically be beneficial for you or help you in this matter?
Yes, for sure. I think the MyInfo sort of framework that the Singapore government has rolled out, it makes it very easy for people who want to sign up for an account to do so, right? So you go to iSTOX.com, you click, and then you do 2 clicks, and then you're in, right? Because everything gets downloaded from your digital identity. But as what Chye said, this doesn't apply to our customers who are coming in from, let's say, China or India or Australia or Europe or wherever else, right? So then you have to go through the usual, uploading of the documents, uploading of your passports and stuff, and we have to go through that biometric screening as well. So that one click and straight through processing would be the holy grail, right? We want to emulate that MyInfo kind of experience. 2 clicks and you're in, to customers from basically all over the world. Now, the way that can happen is that you have maybe one entity that pulls all this data in, and we and other fintech players tap into that entity, and it sort of taps into national databases. So that would be very, very, very nice. The other thing that I would like to add is as more and more data sets get brought onto this national digital identity platforms, the faster and more efficient it would be to onboard. So, for example, bank accounts, right? For example, sources of wealth. For example, land title ownership, right? These things would help. For example, AI accredited investor-only platforms like iSTOX help determine whether or not somebody is an accredited investor or not, just by one click of a button. Right now, it is a rather more not straightforward process whereby they have to upload certain supporting documents and so on. It's still fast, but it can be made faster. So I'm always on the lookout for things in the workflow that can be automated using technology. And if anyone has a solution for that, I'd be very happy to listen to that.
Great. Diana, we talked about data standards and interoperability. Speaking of the future of regulation as a service, how do you see this domain evolving? And what is the importance of data standards in this field? And maybe that might be the holy grail. Could you elaborate a little bit on that, Diana?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess that to add as well to what my colleagues were saying, we think that the reality, and we have been working at Suade on data standards from day one. And actually we have an open source project that has been extremely popular around financial regulatory data standards, which I presented in the first FinTech festival in Singapore a few years ago. But effectively, what we think Regtech can be doing is actually bring those standards forward. So I think there are obviously quite a lot of standards out there when it comes to different enterprise pieces like ISO and all of that, but there is a reality that some of those standards are actually quite antiquated for what we need as innovators and regulatory technologies to continue thriving. And so data standards is one of those. Publishing standards is another one. Different guidance, for example, at how like AI should be utilized in the industry are also quite important as well. So I think that the data standards piece is one of those where we demand this, and we should be demanding this from the regulators and from the industry. And Regtech has actually in many ways the opportunity to not just follow standards that are out there, but actually to take the lead. And so for us, that has been very much the case. And so I think that it's something that has allowed us to also have a platform, for example, in some of the work that we do to lobby are in things like agile governance, where you're also asking the regulators and governments to change the way that they're implementing legislation, to change the way that they're implementing different rules as a way that's a lot more agile, to really understand technology in the right way, so that we don't end up with antiquated laws and with things that don't really work for the modern era, and where innovators are trying to basically create technology that then, because of random laws, cannot really be implemented. There is actually work recently that we've done with the OECD and the World Economic Forum as well, where that concept of agile governance, of demanding data standards, of demanding from regulators and legislators to really understand technology better and to the right level of detail, would actually not have been possible for us to have a voice in if we were not a Regtech, if we were not innovating. So I think the future for regulatory technology companies, when you're doing something that's pioneering, is actually to have a voice in those conversations, because Regtech has regulation in that conversation. And so it means that we see things in a certain way where other fintechs don't necessarily have a point of view, or don't necessarily have the same kind of access, because of the fact that we're dealing with regulation every day. And it's really becoming, I think, a role for us to really be able to help with that.
And if you talked about, the regulators, and there are so many regulators out there, and some jurisdictions are further along the line than others. Which ones are the most furthest ahead regards to modernizing financial regulation and being this agile regulator?
So obviously the MAS is awesome. It's legendary, and we have been working with them for the past few years and love the work and their vision for digital supervision and digital approaches when it comes to regulation. I think, obviously the UK has also been at the forefront of some of this with DFC and the Bank of England. You see actually the ECB, so the European Central Bank, starting to do some moves in that direction. APRA, the Canadian regulator, and some of the feds have actually been quite open to that conversation as well. So what you find is that obviously there's quite a lot, maybe a bit more of a bullish approach when it comes to digitization and regulation from some of the more sophisticated economies. And we've seen actually the World Bank being quite active in trying to help smaller economies to really get into that conversation as well. So I think that in many ways it's going to be, again, like a matter of leadership, where you want actually some of the economies that have financial environments that are more sophisticated to also help guide some of the economies that are less sophisticated to really try to follow the best principles when it comes to regulation. But I think that it is almost an opportunity. I mean, there's some things that we have observed, for example, from the central banks in Latin America and even in Africa, where those countries and those regulators almost have an opportunity to start cleaner, because they haven't had to be implementing sophisticated regulation for as long. And so what that means fundamentally is that from a tech perspective, they can almost be earlier adopters of better innovation, just because they don't have the legacy technologies that maybe have been implemented over the past few years for some of the more sophisticated technologies. So they're not necessarily as ahead, but I think that they could actually catch up very quickly because they have less legacy infrastructure problems than what we have found in some of the larger economies.
Okay, thanks. And maybe as a sort of a last wrapping up question, if we look into the reality of money laundering, it's according to McKinsey, 2 trillion laundered annually through the global banking system, and this still translates in 2 to 5% of global GDP. The figures, what is basically reported by Europol, only 2% of criminal proceeds are frozen and 1% is confiscated in the EU. So there are still a lot of things to be done. We talked about a couple of things that are basically the holy grail: digital identity, data standards, child kids, any other things that we really need to improve or have solving to really solve this issue. And yes.
I think, yeah, sure. Thanks. That's an interesting question there. Now, I think we need to remember, at least as far as I'm concerned, Regtech as a if you distill it down, it's a software. Typically, it's an application and is used by regulated entities to help them better comply. Is it a crime buster solution? I would suggest it's not complete on its own to be, be able to address all the money laundering issues out there in the world. Now, why is that the case? It's because whilst you've quoted about 3 to 5% of global GDP that is being reported as being laundered, don't forget that a large percentage of what's actually been laundered is actually in fiat currency. That is in hard cash. So which means that it's sort of, it's in circulations out there in the market, money, cold hard cash is being used for the purpose of money laundering, and a lot of that is actually there. So which is why I believe that the push for every jurisdiction, I think this is also one of the hottest topic that's been talked about, the central bank digital currency, and that may eventuate into something that there is actually no pieces of paper, which is called, the notes, the cash in the future, which means that every single dollar, any currency in the world, is in a digital form. Then you will be able to track and you will be able to carry out quite a fair bit of monitoring and perhaps identifying, or I call them the detective control bit, whether at the institution level or whether it's at the jurisdiction and the global, crime buster level. So that probably will be somewhere we will see a better outcome in terms of addressing this huge gap of, there's so much money that's being laundered and only this amount is being confiscated. And don't forget, there's a lot of these are also in different asset classes, including, properties, including some may say cryptocurrency, for example, but I reckon it's only a very small percentage of what actually gets laundered through the fiat currency.
Thanks. So I think we have to end it. So it's digital identity, standardization, Regtech, but also basically the cashless society, central bank digital currencies, and of course, the human factor is also important. Policies and how people basically, that's always the weakest link. Thanks for now. It's time. I want to thank my excellent panel for this great conversation and wish you all a very good rest of the day or evening.